I talked a lot about parish mission and parish input and all that, so I thought it'd be handy to just have and see once again not only our parish mission statement, which is building God's kingdom by growing and making disciples through love of God and neighbor, but also the 7 goals that our parish council has said. These are goals that we adopted that came from our Spiritual Life and Evangelization Commission. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. It's Mr. Eric Atkins. Eric is the Director of Buildings and Grounds for the entire Archdiocese, so I can't imagine what a typical day in your life would be like. I happened to stop by the office today. I was up in Indianapolis and stopped by his office, and he was on the phone dealing with some roof or hail damage or something, and I imagine you get all those kind of calls all the time, and so I'm glad we have somebody like Eric doing that. And you've been with the well, you can tell how long you've been with the diocese and all that. So, Mr. Eric Atkins.
Great. Thank you, Father. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Little brief description about myself. I guess Father Tom said I'm Eric Atkins, and I oversee Department of Management Services for the diocese, which is responsible for new construction, renovation, real estate, building maintenance, anything that goes wrong with the church building or school building or a rectory. My department gets involved with it. I've been with the diocese now for 12 years this fall. Prior to that, I was with the Diocese of Lafayette in north central Indiana for 3 years. And then prior to that, I was a practicing architect for 17 years in Indianapolis. I'm married, have 3 children. My wife's a school teacher for a Catholic school in Indianapolis. All 3 of our children have gone to Catholic grade schools, Catholic high schools. And so that's a little bit about me. We have 1 child just graduated from high school last year, so we're kind of working into the empty nester routine, but not there yet. The purpose of this session is to talk about the practical considerations a parish needs to address in the planning and design of a new church. We'd like to talk about some of these specific items that are involved in those considerations, but also talk about some of the spiritual aspects of it. And I want to go back to what Father Pat Weidelman spoke about in your last session, as he talked about some of the pillars of good church design. And I want to reiterate those because I think they're very important to keep in mind as you go through the process of designing a new church. There's basically 5 of them that I've broken. I think he had 4, but I've broken down into 5 actual components. One is built for beauty, built for Catholic. When I say Catholic, we're talking about using iconography and symbols and images in the church that represent the Catholic faith. Building for worship and the sacraments that are celebrated within that church. Building for permanence. We're talking about building for more than just one generation. Many times in the past we've built churches. We've only thought about where we are today and the groups that we're just building for at that point. We want to build for more than just one generation. We want to build for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren that will be coming after us. And then building the best you can build. And I think that's important because many times when we get into building a church, we think about how little can we spend? How can we get this church built with as little amount of money as possible? And we like to think upon it as you are building something that's very, very important to the faith and helping to build the faith of your community. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that what we're building needs to be beautiful, and it needs to be the best that you as a community can possibly build. Get into just the practical considerations to building the church. And Built of Living Stones, if you read chapter 4, talks about some of those practical considerations. But also the Archdiocese of Indianapolis has some practical considerations that we have to follow. There are archdiocesan procedures for building and renovation projects that the Archbishop has assembled as a document that we follow, and it's based on Code of Canon Law, which basically states that the bishop is the only person that can approve the construction of a new church. So he's laid out some pretty detailed guidelines and procedures that we have to follow in the design and building of a church. Part of that is the bishop designates a group of consultative bodies to assist him in reviewing and making sure the church meets the standards that he would like to see built, and also the standards that the church would like to see built. And there are basically 3 commissions that he has appointed or designated to help him in that process. It's the Archdiocesan Finance Council, the Archdiocesan Church Art and Architecture Commission, and the Archdiocesan Building Commission. And the Finance Council of the Archdiocese helps the bishop and helps the parishes understand financially what they can and cannot do, and long term what kind of impact it's going to have on your parish. The Archdiocesan Church Art and Architecture Commission assists the bishop and the parishes in the review of the design of the church through the various phases, and then makes recommendations to the bishop on whether or not this is a good design to proceed with, or if we need to make modifications to the church design. The Archdiocesan Building Commission, which I sit on as chairperson, in fact we had our monthly meeting today, we meet the second Tuesday of each month, reviews all building construction projects and renovation projects across the entire diocese to make sure technically they meet the standards, make sure building code wise they meet the standards, make sure from a functional standpoint they meet the standards. And all of these 3 bodies are made up of volunteers from throughout the diocese. The Finance Council is chaired by our Chief Financial Officer. There are several staff members from the diocese that sit on that Finance Council, but it's also made up of accountants, financial consultants, bankers throughout the diocese. There may be some folks here that sit on the Finance Council. I don't know. If you do sit on the council, thank you for your work that you do. The Archdiocesan Church Art and Architecture Commission is made up of volunteers also. Father Pat Weidelman chairs that commission as the Director of the Office of Worship. I sit on that commission as a liaison between the Building Commission and the Art and Architecture. And then we have a group of volunteers that are made up of professionals. Michael Egan, who's been working with your parish for a while now, sits on that commission, as well as we have an artist. We have another priest from the diocese who has an artistic background, and we hope to be adding a few more members to that commission. It's made up of a large group of consultative bodies, a lot of volunteers. And as I said, the Building Commission is made up of professionals, architects, engineers, and builders that assist me in helping to review those various projects. As we get into just the practical considerations, Built of Living Stones talks about starting with the master plan. And it's interesting that that's in here, because I think that's probably the most important thing any parish can do. And I try and encourage all parishes to start out with a master plan when they're beginning to talk about a new construction or major renovation on their campus. The master plan is very important for 2 reasons. Is that first, it creates a vision for your overall campus, and a vision that inspires maximum participation and support for the vision by all the parishioners. But second, and probably most importantly, it allows for any interim improvements or interim projects to occur that are consistent with that vision. The last thing, as the parish has been working through this master planning process at the various campuses you've been exploring, the last thing you want to do is to do an interim project that might be a storage building on a site, and you build the storage building and you find out 3 years later that that's where the church should have been built. Now you got to tear the storage building down, or you got to put the church in a location on the site that's really not conducive to the long-term benefit of the church or the entire campus. So it's very important that the master plan process be very thorough, very well thought out, and it allows the parish to understand what the overall vision is for the parish with regard to that master plan. Also, a good part of that vision is understanding from a financial standpoint what that vision is going to cost. It's important to understand overall what it's going to cost, and then how you can take that vision and break it down into bite-sized pieces so you can implement that vision in a systematic and organized manner. Part of Built of Living Stones talked about the role of the parish community in assessing the need for a new church, which your parish has done a very good job of diligently reviewing that need. And then an assessment of the ability to pay for a new church. That's always probably the most difficult process. The difficult part of the entire process is how to pay for this church. But it's a spiritual exercise, I believe, having gone through this many times in my own life, in my own parish, and then gone through it many times with other parishes throughout the diocese. I'd like to get into the roles within the parish as you begin to talk about the design of a new church. There are basically 5 entities within the parish that are important to have in place for the successful design of a new church. Obviously is the pastor. The pastor is the leader in the entire process. So you need a good leader that will lead this process. Number 2 is the parish building committee. The parish building committee is going to be working with the nuts and bolts of the design of the new church with the architect and the engineers. 3 is the pastoral council. It's going to be reviewing the design with the parish building committee and will be giving approval to the parish building committee the various phases of the project to move forward. The 4th is the parish finance council. They've got to be able to review and approve the financial aspects of what this church is going to cost. And the stewardship capital campaign committee, which is assisting the parish in raising the funds for the project. I'd like to go back to what the parish building committee does. I talked about them doing the nuts and bolts of the project. The parish building committee usually spend many, many hours meeting with the design team, going through the nuts and bolts of how this conceptual design gets put down into a real building. And there are usually 4 phases that the building committee is working with the architect in that process. The first phase is called schematic design, which is kind of what I refer to as kind of a conceptual image of what this church is going to look like, how big it's going to be, and approximately what it's going to cost. But before they start into that, it's very important that the building committee work with the architect to understand what is the overall budget for this project before they even start designing anything. And as I talked about at the beginning, that it's very important that we try and build the best we can possibly build as a community. That is the point where a tremendous amount of discernment needs to take place from the parish, on the parish side, on what the parish is going to spend for their new church. I have seen many parishes try and build something very, very low quality, get as much built for as little amount of money as possible, which is one way to do it. But it's also been my experience it's probably the wrong way to do it, because you end up paying more in the long run because of that. But schematic design, as I talked about, is kind of the conceptual image of what this church is going to look like. And it's important to understand what that cost is. As part of the understanding the budget and what the project is going to cost, there's a balancing act that occurs in the design and budgeting process. There's usually 3 parts to any building construction project. There's the cost of the project, there's the scope, which is the size and quality of the size and configuration of the building, and then the third is the quality of the materials used in the building. Someone told me many years ago, and I think it's a pretty wise thought, that the owner can control 2 of those. They can tell the architect and the engineers how big it's going to be, what's going to be in that building, the size of those spaces, and then they can tell the owner or tell the architect how much they want to spend. Then we have to allow the architect and the engineer to work with the parish and the owner to say, okay, if you're going to tell me it's this much money and it's this big, you have to give me the ability to tell you what level of quality I can provide for you for what you're trying to do. So it's this balancing act, and it's balancing from both sides. It's the architect and the engineers working on the quality side and trying to balance out the quality of the building, whether it's all brick on the outside or some brick and some stone, or some brick and some lower quality materials, whatever that might be, to try and get a balanced product for this project. The second part of the building committee's process is called the design development phase. And design development is much more intense, much more involved with the building committee and the architects and engineers, and they're working on more of the details of what's happening inside, how it's going to be assembled, how it's going to function, how it's going to work together. I like to say that's probably where the design comes together and the parish and the community truly understand what this building is going to look like, and a very good understanding of what it's going to cost, how it's going to look on the site, how it's going to look on the outside, how it's going to look on the inside, what the materials are going to be on the inside and outside of this building. So that's the design development phase. And the third that the building committee is going to be working on is the construction document phase. They're going to be working with the architects and engineers to begin to assemble the construction instructions, as I like to call them. It's the documents that the contractors are going to use to build this building. It's the documents that the contractors are going to use to provide final pricing to you as the owner on what it's going to cost to build this building. They're very detailed documents. They take a lot of time and energy for the architects and engineers to go through, but they also take a lot of time and energy for the building committee to go through to make sure all the details that were laid out in the early part of the project have been incorporated and are following the guidelines or the direction that the parish has given them. And the fourth phase is the most exciting. It's the construction phase. Once you know what it's going to cost, once you have all the details from the drawings on how it's going to be put together, to begin the construction phase. I'd like to kind of go into the next part of the practical considerations is more of the role of the various professionals that are involved in this process. I've talked to architects and engineers, but the architects also have a number of other consultants, multiple engineers that are part of the project. Your architect is not the only one that's working on this project. He or she may be the person you're seeing the most, but that architect has a number of consultants that are working with them behind the scenes. They're mechanical engineers that are putting together all the heating and cooling documents on how this building is going to function. Construction engineers are going to help tell us how this building is going to stand up. We have the electrical engineers. They're going to tell us how we're going to light this building. The plumbing engineers are going to tell us how the plumbing fixtures and the restrooms and fire sprinkler systems are all going to work together. There's also the builder or the contractor. And there also might be a liturgical consultant that the parish may elect to hire as a part of the process also. Liturgical consultants assist the parish and the architect in understanding from a liturgical standpoint how best to lay out the interior of a church. From a Catholic standpoint, that's very important. As you all know, there's a big difference between a Catholic church and a Protestant church and how it functions and what happens on the inside, what those different components are. There's a handout here, a document I'll leave with you that lists all the different components that go into a church, a Catholic church, that I think would be beneficial. It lists all the furniture, it lists the various pieces and parts and where they go within the building. That'll be very beneficial for the building committee. It's a general list of church furnishings. It talks about the sanctuary area. It talks about the nave or the area where the pews are set up. It talks about sacristies. It talks about the vestibule, devotional areas, the chapel area. It's a very detailed list that I think is very helpful for the committee as it goes through that process. As a part of the role of professionals, I like to encourage our parishes to look upon the process of designing a new church as a collaborative effort between the parish, the architect and engineers, and the builders. Many times when you get into a design and construction process, it can become very adversarial, especially when it gets down to the dollars and cents for the project. I believe it's very important to look upon those three components, the owner, the architect, engineer, and the builder, as a team. They're coming together as a team to try and meet the common goal of building the best church they can possibly build for your community. And that is I wouldn't say it's a difficult process, but it's a very detailed process. It's a process that needs to be followed in a collaborative effort. Part of that collaborative effort, I like to reiterate to our parishes that in order to help make it a collaborative effort, we need to be sensitive to the fact that fair and just compensation for the design professionals and the contractors is important. It's a just thing, and it's the right thing to do. So we get into the practical considerations. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the design elements and the components that make up the church and how they all fit together. I guess probably the first thing is just talking about the site, where the building is going to be built. I think it's important that we understand that the new church, the building itself, needs to work with the site, not against the site. I was just reviewing an existing church building today with our building commission that is having serious water infiltration problems in their church. It's a building that has the heating ductwork that runs under the floor and then comes up through the floor and heats and cools the building, and the air handling unit sits outside. For some reason, water has gotten in, and we believe it's gotten in because of the way the building was built into the side of a hill. All the water is up high and it's running down to the church and running into the church. Now we have serious mold growing inside the church, and the parish is doing some significant remediation right now, trying to eliminate the mold growth that's occurring inside the church. And it's all a result of probably improper siting of this new church building on the site from the very beginning. Two, it's probably a result of maybe some sump pumps that had to be put in as part of the design to keep the water out that have failed recently, and now water is running inside the church. So they're having to spend some time and money and energy correcting a problem that could have been avoided if they had properly sited the church from the very beginning. So I always like to say, work with your site, place your buildings on the site so they work with the site and not against the site. Another part of probably good church design is making sure that all feel welcome when they come to that church. They need to feel welcome, and the church needs to be accessible to all. The other part of the church design talks about the choice of building materials. And if we go back to the pillars, the guiding principles for church design, I think if we talk about the type of materials that are selected for the church on the exterior and the interior, we want to make sure that what we're selecting is something that's solid, very stable, will have a long life, and will not have a tremendous amount of maintenance cost to maintain the building or to maintain those elements of the building. Part of the choice of building materials is faithful stewardship of the earth's resources. I think Pope Francis has spoken very clearly to that recently, in that we need to be partners in the development of sustainable architecture. I read somewhere recently that the greatest consumer of energy are buildings. And we're heating and cooling, we're lighting these buildings. And anything we can do to reduce the amount of energy consumption it takes to manufacture the materials that go into the building, the construction of the building, or the lighting, heating, cooling, and maintenance of that building goes a long way toward helping the environment and minimizing our impact on the environment and being good stewards of the environment. Our own Archbishop has been working pretty diligently to try and get us within my department to focus upon that aspect of what we do as a church, well, what my department does to help support the church. Part of that is helping parishes understand how they can make their buildings more energy efficient. And during the design process, that's probably very important to talk to your architects and engineers about, is how can we incorporate elements or systems into this building that will be as energy efficient as possible, will be as sustainable as possible, and over the long term, cost the parish less money and be better for the environment. And the third aspect of choice of building materials is what I refer to as building for permanence, so that we build something that's going to sustain the building over time. As part of the design of a new church, one of the biggest challenges, well, not the biggest challenge, but one of the challenges we have are the acoustics within the inside of the church. How the sound reacts in the church building is very critical. Professional acoustical consultants are vital in the overall design of the worship environment, so that not only the spoken word but the music are compatible within the space. It's great to have a church with a lot of reverberation so that the music can be very vibrant and expressive within the church. But if the music dominates the spoken word within the church, and there are a number of churches within their diocese where that has happened, the spoken word gets lost and the worship experience becomes very, very poor for the congregation. So there's a balancing act between the spoken word and the music within the church. And the choice of the materials, interior materials on the inside of the church, their placement inside the church, and the arrangement of the assembly within the church are all critical to the control of those acoustics within the interior of that church. Another part of an element in the design of the new church is the lighting. There are basically 4 elements of lighting within any church building. There's lighting for the reading by the congregation. There's lighting of the sanctuary that spotlights the majority of the action that's occurring within the worship environment. It's general lighting to see within the space. And then it's what I call architectural lighting that enhances the worship space. That architectural lighting can be very subtle, it can be very dramatic, but all 4 elements of that lighting are important to make that worship space work as a whole. I want to get into construction, what I call what's referred to as the construction process. Before I get there, I want to talk about a little bit the architectural procedures for building and renovation projects. Before any project can start construction, obviously, we have to make sure it can be paid for. Number 2, we have to make sure technically and worship-wise it works for the Catholic environment. So those 2 elements have to be verified. The construction process. Construction has started the same way it has for centuries. We go out and we dig a hole. First thing we do. Construction is messy, it's slow, frustrating at times, but ultimately can be very exciting for the entire parish. The design process happens many times behind closed doors. Once the construction gets going, everyone can see what's happening, and it becomes very exciting, but it goes very, very slow. We like to encourage, during the construction process, to keep the parishioners involved and to help celebrate that process, is to allow the parish to be involved in the different milestones of the construction. Obviously, there's the groundbreaking that occurs before the digging of the hole begins. It's basically the digging that the parish does. There are other various milestones as the construction process goes forward. Once the steel or the actual structure is assembled, Usually there's a flag raising or flag placement ceremony that occurs, and that's an opportunity for the parish to get involved and be a part of that celebration. Other sections where the building gets fully enclosed, maybe sections where the floor of the sanctuary gets poured and it begins to look like a church and begins to take shape and form. It's important to bring the parish in and let them be a part and see what's going on and experience the birth that's occurring on your parish site. Part of the construction process could possibly involve some additional cost as construction gets moving forward. As I talked early on about the balancing act between scope, budget, and quality, within that budget, there have to be factors for contingency placed into the overall budget to factor in unforeseen conditions or changes in the scope of the project as it goes through the process of design. But as it gets into construction, there are usually potentially additional costs that come up that have to be anticipated. One of those costs we refer to as unforeseen conditions. Conditions that we try and anticipate, we try and plan for, we try and investigate as much as possible, and that might be soft soils that are underground where the building is going to be going. There are investigation and analysis done to determine is the ground suitable enough to support this building, and it's done through probes that are done down into the ground to determine the bearing capacity of that soil. But there are times where those probes that are done early on don't always identify all those potentially bad areas on the ground, and they're not found until they start digging that hole and put the building up. And some remedial work sometimes needs to happen to take that unsuitable material out of the ground and put suitable material back into the ground so you can physically build the building on top of it. So it's important to have some money set aside for some of those unforeseen conditions. The second part of additional cost during construction are owner changes. We like to minimize those changes, and we minimize those changes by making sure that planning takes place early on with the architects and engineers so that all the questions, all the ideas, all the wants and needs can be put out on the table. They can be thought through, they can be planned out, and they can be assembled into the overall budget to make sure things work as a whole. We don't want to do owner changes during the construction phase because they cost money, usually a lot more money. So we want to minimize those. And many of those owner changes are eliminated through the review process that happens at the diocese also. So the review process with the Art and Architecture Commission, the review process with the Archdiocese Building Commission. We go through very detailed review and analysis of the drawings through the different phases of development to make sure we can minimize those changes that might occur during the construction phase. And the third potential cost, it would just be errors and omissions in the documents. I always like to tell people we're all human, we all make mistakes, but we work very diligently through the entire process to make sure those mistakes are minimized and kept to a minimum so that the process can move forward in a very good manner. As you get into the overall church design, you may be doing some church visits. I don't know if your parish has visited. You have done? Okay. Going to visit other churches that have been recently built or may have been built for quite some time that you've not had a chance to see is a very good opportunity to envision how a church design is working for other congregations. I have some documents here I'll leave with you that I think are very helpful. This is a church visit document that talks about church assessment form with design guidelines that allows you to go through the church and then afterward look at it in a rather subjective manner and actually begins asking questions of you with regard to how you experienced that church, what you saw there, what were some of the things that you saw that worked, that didn't work. I think would be very helpful. And then there's also a document here that talks about church visits after Mass reflection questions that I think are helpful If you can go to a church and actually experience that church in a Mass setting, just walking through a church as a visitor is one way to experience it, but actually going there and celebrating Mass with that congregation is a wonderful way to truly experience how that church functions and works and supports the faith community in that parish. I also have a document here that I think is helpful. As a part of the design process, there will be, we talked about liturgical consultants that will help in the process. There will also probably be artists that will be brought in to assist in the design or selection of artwork on the interior of the church. It seemed like there was a period of time after Second Vatican Council II where we seemed to strip the interior of many of our churches of all of the beautiful imagery and the statues. Even some of the stained glass windows were taken out of some beautiful historic churches. I think we've, on 180 degrees, beginning to bring those back. We want them back because they help reinforce our faith and teach us about our faith. There's a document here that I'll leave with you. Is an artist interview form that your building committee or liturgical committee can use in helping to select an artist that might be appropriate for your parish to look at those various aspects of art within the church. And then there's a document here that I came across recently. As we talked about the balancing act between budget, scope, and quality of your project. It's called a value engineering worksheet. And we talked, I spoke early on about trying to build the best you can possibly build and build for beauty. And to make sure you understand your budget so it matches what you're trying to do from a beauty and building the best you can build. This is a value engineering worksheet that I think is very helpful for any building committee to begin to look at if you have a project that seems to come in over budget and you need to find some way to the scope or the quality of the project down to your budget. This is an evaluation and prioritization worksheet that I think is very helpful for your building committee to begin to look at the aspects of the project that might need to be reduced from the project from a standpoint of cost and timing. Did we promise this component of the building to the parish? Is it a quality that we told the parish we were going to achieve in this project? Is it structural? Is it a component of the building that we have to have? Is it essential to the mission of the church? So I think this is a very good worksheet to have as the building committee works through their process. A couple books here, I think they're very helpful. You've got Built of Living Stones, I think. This is a very good and practical and faith-filled book and guideline that National Conference of Catholic Bishops put out a number of years ago. It's a very good document. Please read it, use it, follow it. I have another book here that I think is very helpful and will be helpful for your building committee in a parish. It's called Building a New Church. It was written by James Healy, Father James Healy. He's a diocesan priest from the Kansas City St. Joseph's Diocese. It's a process manual for pastors and lay leaders. It, I think, is a very good complement to Built of Living Stones and acts as a very good guiding process for the design and building process. I believe, as I read this book was put together by Father Healy as he was working with his parish on the construction of a new church in Independence, Missouri. And he wrote this book after he'd gone through that process. So he has the good and the bad in here, and I think it's a very helpful process. There's also an appendix in the back that has a list of 14 different documents that I think will be very beneficial. These documents I have up here are all from this appendix. And I did not make copies for everyone. I just made one copy because it's a copyrighted document. So I don't want to get into a copywriting process, copywriting infringement violation here. But since we have this book, we bought this book, they allow us to make one copy. So that's here for you. I think these are both very valuable books and guidelines and to help you in that process. Probably, I'll close here with probably the most important factor, and this is directly from Built of Living Stones in the second paragraph. And it talks about it takes many different people with different levels of talent and expertise to build a new church. It says, since no single pastor or parish possesses the totality of expertise or vision required to execute a project of such great scope, the congregation and clergy will need to recognize the areas of their own competence, the role of the diocesan bishop and diocesan personnel, and their limits beyond which the assistance of experts will be required. Respect and appreciation for the competence of others in their respective fields is essential for good teamwork. As I said early on, it's a collaborative process between your building committee, your architects and engineers, your contractors, and your parish. You all come together with your own treasures and your talents. And I say I'm here to be of assistance in this entire process. My office is. The archdiocesan personnel are here to be of assistance through this entire process. The Archbishop is here to be of assistance in this entire process. We welcome and encourage active participation of all parishioners, and we pray for your success. We want to be a part of that success. I open up for questions, comments. Yes, sir.
Eric, in terms of best practice for the building committee, is it good to have representatives of the pastoral council, finance committee, stewardship? That should they have a representative on the building committee, just from a communication standpoint, or does that matter one way or the other?
It's not a good. It's a good idea to have them as a part of that process. They may not have the time. They may not feel like they have the expertise to be a part of that building committee. But I think that would be a very good thing to have happen. Many times people ask me how big should the building committee be. Someone told me a number of years ago that Jesus had it probably correct when he selected 12 disciples to join him. He said that was a good number. Any more than that, it's too many to handle. Any less, there's too much work for a limited number of people to do. But 12 is a good number. And how the components of that committee, probably sit down and talk with your pastor and pastoral council to determine who should be a part of that. But I think that's a very good recommendation, if they have the time to be a part of that process. Yes.
I'll jump one in here. The document talked a lot about parish participation, and this is as much to Michael as it is to you, Eric. What ways have you used in the past to involve the whole parish in the process?
Sure.
I mean, we gave everybody the opportunity to serve on this committee, to be a part of this team, but what other ways can we involve people in terms of gathering input?
I can tell you what we've seen happen in other parishes that has been useful. We have town hall meetings at various stages of the development of the design. I've seen a town hall meeting happen in the early stages of the design where the parish got together on a Saturday afternoon in their cafeteria, and they broke down into small groups. And the architects had the various components of the building laid out in 3D blocks, where the sanctuary goes, a block for the sanctuary, a block for the nave, a block for the baptistry, a block for the narthex, a block for the chapel. And each committee was able to arrange those blocks how they felt like the church should be organized. And then they all came back together as a group and presented their various designs to the overall parish, to try and build consensus on how they would like to see their church organized and designed. Now, obviously, there are certain components of the design that are critical that need to happen a certain way. But in that process, it was interesting that they all kind of came together, and I think there were 5 different small groups. When they all came back together, there was a general consensus on how they all wanted the church to be arranged. It was rather interesting to see that happen. But I think it's important at the various stages of the design to present that design to the entire committee through town hall meetings so the parish understands what's happening, they understand what the cost of that project is, they understand the quality of that design as it's evolving. Michael, I don't know if you want to, any other ideas?
Well, I think that's one of the best ideas, Eric, is to try to have opportunities where the parish can weigh in at different points of the direction things are headed. You know, that there's a good open dialogue. Everybody doesn't have to be on the building committee. There are other aspects, you know, liturgical furnishings, sacred art. Those things take a lot of time, and they're just as a valid part of the whole process as everything else. And you know, certain people are more geared to different areas, so you might think about how people might serve that way as well.
You may want to consider giving the whole parish homework. Say visit, everybody can hand visit 5 churches, and 5 things you liked about it and 5 things you didn't like about it. And then you can hold that and get a consensus of other than the committee here, but just like we're going to do when we do our, I assume we'll do something like that when we do. That would get everybody else the chance to be on without being on. Get their 2 cents on.
It's a good idea. It's maximum participation of the entire congregation.
Get their own time.
Yes.
Get their own time.
Yes.
How do you avoid having too much help? He mentions get everybody to give you fast suggestions. That's a lot of information to have to go through. Is there a way to pare down and get a quality amount of information from the rest of the parish without being inundated?
Well, I guess I'd say designing and building a new church for a parish is probably the most important thing your parish will do for a very, very long time. I think it's important that there be as much work put into it as possible by everyone. And it is going to take time and energy to go through all the different ideas, the different thoughts that people have. I think it needs to happen. It does take work, but in order to have a good finished product that everyone can be proud of and can want to participate in from a financial standpoint, but also want to worship there. I think they all need to, we need to accept everyone's thoughts and ideas in the process.
Michael, will you rely on us to come up with those ideas, or will you, and when those things happen, or will you say we really need to be taking this to the parish now to gather that input? Do you have that built in? How did you do that in the previous churches that you built?
I think in our initial meeting, when we start back up here again, we put together that process of what are those steps, what are those milestones, when do we engage the parish as a whole. You know, the other aspect of this would be various ministries, you know, the music ministry and the sacristans and the maybe the new Catholics, you know, just how different groups fit into the whole process and how they can provide information. So I guess what we would do is we'd come up with a process at the beginning is what we usually do.
One thing that I think is also important to realize is that you have to be careful about what you say and be careful about what you hear and what you think you hear. And again, I'm going to give you an example. The last time we were here, we were gathered, the last time we met with Father Beidelman, we were over at St. Paul's, and I said, you know, something about the tabernacle needs to be able to be seen from, you know, when you walk into church, you should be able to find the tabernacle. And somebody said, I was really glad to hear you say, Father, that the tabernacle should be in church. I didn't say that. All right, so you have to be careful of what you see and hear. I just said the tabernacle needs to be found when you're able to walk into church. I didn't say it needed to be in church. You know, and I'm not saying that it shouldn't be in church. All right, so we just have to be careful as we're talking, because sometimes you say something and you think everybody understands what you said, but then you later found out, well, no, they didn't hear what I thought I said. So we just have to be careful about that, and that just, you know, means we have to have that continued dialogue back and forth as we go through the selections of each of these things and how those things work together.
Father, my daughter has been at several different churches that have built brand new churches. And one of them we went to in Findlay, Ohio. Whenever we're out at church, and I don't know if we're allowed to, can we take pictures and then bring them back to the committee? Are we allowed to take pictures of inside of other churches?
Sure.
That's a good idea.
I mean, you know, if the pastor's standing around or somebody's standing around, say, do you mind if I do this?
Okay.
I've taken some in St. Louis de Montfort, in Fishers. I took some over at St. Aloysius in Pewee Valley. I've got those on my phone. And I think to make that form available that we'll be using when we go to visit churches, to make that available, I think, Kenny, your idea, make that available. People say, hey, if you happen to be in a church, you know, this is a form you can use, fill it out, submit it to the building planning team. That's a great way to involve people. I like that. Any other questions for Eric? Thank you for making the trip down to southern Indiana. We appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. Beautiful night.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a beautiful night. A couple of